My name is Dave Elving. I'm the interim director here at San Francisco Camera Work, and welcome to the fourth in our series of talks around cell signals, our online exhibition curated by Pete Brook. If you haven't seen it yet, please visit our website at sfcamerawork.org. All of the work in the exhibition is incredibly powerful and timely. And while you're there, you can become a member or donate, because of course we rely on your support to make programming like this possible. As we begin, a note that we'll be recording the session so we can share it online. And we welcome your questions. As the panel progresses tonight, please add your questions in the Zoom chat. Our prior conversations around this work have focused on the human toll of systemic injustice and mass incarceration. We began to understand just how ingrained they are with our culture, with our curator's talk. We saw what it meant to use a camera in prison at our artists panel. And at our last discussion, we heard from former inmates as they described the challenges they face after incarceration. Today, we turn our attention to aspects of systemic injustice that we encounter every day, but which often seem invisible: facial recognition technologies and artificial intelligence algorithms. These tools that allow us to unlock our phones with a glance and which can make us look like talking koala bears are being used by massive corporations, governments, and law enforcement to sell our attention and track our activities. We'll explore the consequences this has for our privacy and our civil rights and our culture as we hear from artists, journalists, and researchers. And guiding us tonight is our guest moderator, Seth Rosenblatt. He's the editor-in-chief and founder of The Parallax, a news website focused on security and privacy. And he's worked in online journalism for 20 years at places like CNET News and Google. So Seth, thank you for being here. I'm going to hand it over to you, and we'll get started tonight.
Great, thank you. I didn't actually work at Google, but I did cover Google. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I'm really excited about this. This is a really neat group that we have. And I'm actually going to step back and turn it right over to our panelists and have them do introductions. And then we're going to take a look at Adam's work, which is really fascinating, and I think will set the tone very well for the following conversation. Let's start with Liz, and we'll just go from there to say a few words about who you are and how your work relates to facial recognition and AI.
Thanks, Seth. Yes, hi everybody. I'm Liz O'Sullivan. I have a couple of different jobs where I work on issues in artificial intelligence as an activist with the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. We focus on New York City and state litigation and legislation nonprofit. And then in my other time, I do spend most of my days as a co-founder and vice president at Arthur AI, which is an algorithmic fairness algorithm auditing company.
Okay, let's move on to Claire.
Hi everyone, I'm Clare Garvie. I work with the Center on Privacy and Technology based at Georgetown Law. We focus on the intersection between new technologies and the risks that they pose to privacy, particularly as they're focused on historically marginalized or vulnerable groups. So every year we put on a conference called The Color of Surveillance, looking at the history around disproportionate surveillance that perpetuates today with new technologies. My research focuses almost exclusively on the use of face recognition technology by state and local law enforcement agencies across the country and the risks that that poses to name a constitutional right, and I'll tell you the risks that it poses to that. I'm really happy to be here today.
Great, thank you. Anastasia, you're next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I am an artist and creative technologist. I've mainly through my practice been exploring the impacts of emerging technologies, sort of the social impacts, and looking really specifically at augmented and virtual reality combined with interaction design, generative design, and also physical installation. I've created a series of works over the last couple of years that explore the intersection of these mediums and really like looking at ways to kind of bring facial recognition technology, also the limitations and capabilities of these technologies to the public through art installation. So I've been through a few different residencies, notably at the Gray Area Foundation, which is how I knew Dave, Mozilla, And I'm also a product designer at Oculus, where I work on spatial computing design for them too. So thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. And Adam, you're up.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm Adam. I'm a black and white traditional photographer, sort of a street photographer, and I work primarily in film. My day job was in computer graphics. And what happened was that doing this project, with this AI project or this machine learning project, I wandered into this realm of facial recognition. And in some ways, I ended up pulling all of cell signals into this. The work that I did wandered into this field of facial recognition. And I think that's sort of like why we're all here right now.
Adam has put together a really interesting presentation on his work. It's going to be really neat. I don't think there's anything quite out there that's quite like it. And I'm going to turn it over to Adam, presuming he's got his mic stuff all sorted out. And the presentation should take about 15 minutes, but it's really going to set the stage for what we're going to talk about.
Okay. Yeah, I think, okay, we're going here. Yeah, about 5 years ago, I decided that I needed to learn about machine learning. I'm an older technology worker, sort of aged out, and I realized that this was fear driving me, and I decided that I might need a job in machine learning one day. So I was the old guy, and I took 2 online courses. After that, the fun part started when I decided to, I asked the questions, can you draw pictures using machine learning? And I had no idea if you could or not. So I went out and did some research, found that you can, and it's tricky. You have to do coding. It's mostly in the domain of the researchers, and you have to read a lot of scientific papers. So I figured out that I could do some of it, and I knew that I wanted to make pictures of people, sort of like a life drawing exercise, and that in order to do that, I would need to find a database of faces. And this led me to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is NIST. It's a federal government, and they maintain a lot of databases for people to, specifically for this purpose, for AI researchers to test their algorithms on. So I found a database and of mugshots that I thought I was going to use, and I'm going to show it to you right now. And I'm going to show you, there are a couple thousand guys here. I'm going to show you 8 of the people. And here they are. Okay, so that's the last guy. I didn't know what I was expecting when I opened it up, but that was not what I expected. I was really disturbed by what I saw. The first thing that I noticed was that a lot of the guys in there were African American, and I think basically almost half of them were Black. I know that the population of African Americans in the country right now is something like 12 to 13%, and this was way over that. So I didn't know, well, I was really bothered because I realized that there would be, there was a racial bias in this data set. And I don't know what would I didn't know what would happen if I were to train a neural net with this biased data set. And then the other thing that was bothering me was I felt like, you know, these guys were being exploited. These images are from the 1930s to about the 1970s. I'm assuming that most of these guys are dead. There's no names, there's no IDs, you don't know what they were arrested for. And really what it came down to in the end was that I kind of felt like I would be experimenting on prisoners. And that really bothered me. So I basically decided I can't work with this database, and I walked away. I just put it aside. And I went off for a year and did other things, studied some more, did other experiments. And I came back to it about a year later and realizing that I really still had some experiments I wanted to do, and all I had was this problematic database. And so I looked at the database again, and I said, you know, well, maybe that's the point. You know, maybe that's what this project is all about. And that if I use this database, then I have a responsibility to talk about the injustices that I see inside it, you know, and I have a responsibility to talk about any results that I get out of it. So that was the deal that I made with myself. And with that, I went on and made these 8 guys here. So I'm going to show you the 8 guys that I made. And where is it? Hang on. Screen share. Okay. Okay, so this is the last guy. And basically, I'm not going to go into the technical details because we would go into the weeds there. But I'm having to calculate the probabilities on every pixel in the output picture. Okay, so there's I'm doing a prediction on every pixel. And when you put that all together, it creates a prediction for the entire image. And you can see how much, you can get an idea of how much calculation this requires, which is a lot. Actually, it uses up all my computer memory. So I have to work at a relatively small scale. And so if you took a picture with your fancy sort of Nikon, Canon, Sony camera, that image would pretty much crash my program immediately. So it is, well, it's a prediction. And I'm going to show you the algorithm that I used was called Pix-to-Pix. This was a paper that was written in 2016 by a bunch of researchers. And for those of you who know Photoshop, Pix-to-Pix works like a really super duper Photoshop filter. And this example here of colorizing a black and white image is probably the thing that I think that Pix-to-Pix does absolutely the best. And what Pix-to-Pix is a neural network architecture. So that's what I got out of their paper, and you know, is the architecture to process the image. So here Pix-to-Pix is doing a black and white to color, and what I'm trying to do is take this face, the front face, and actually turn the head and come up with a completely different composition. And Pix-to-Pix was not designed to do this, but after that year of studying machine learning architecture, I realized that Pix-to-Pix could do it. So I just went ahead and shoved all my mugshot photos into Pix-to-Pix. And for the most part, it worked. but it was struggling a bit. And because I was really pushing it too hard, and the problem was trying to come up with, a plausible profile for this face. So what I did was I broke the problem into 2 steps to make the mugshot. And the first step, I had it concentrate on just working on the composition. So I trained the neural net to, instead of drawing the picture, I had it draw this chalk outline so that we could work on the contours here and work on working out the face. Because to the computer, to the human, the profile, we have very specific proportions that we all recognize. But to the computer, this profile was a completely random squiggle. And then the second step was that I made a second neural net also with pix-to-pix. And this network, I now have 2 inputs where I add this chalk outline, and those 2 inputs are used to draw the final output. And this was actually the easy step for pix-to-pix, because really all I'm asking it for it to do here is I want it to treat this chalk outline like a coloring book and just color in this photo and that color in this chalk outline, and you will get the final output. So I'm going to show you an actual example of this in action. And what we have here is a little 1-minute movie of step 1. And in this step, the machine learning neural net is trying to learn how to draw this guy's face profile. So you see a little bit of an evolution here, and it's struggling. And the fact is that this program my algorithm doesn't work very well right now. I only have 512 examples in my training set where I should have 25,000 or 250,000. But really, this exercise is mostly a proof of concept. It's not about accuracy. I know I'm not going to get a real accurate output here, but it was all I needed to know was that this was going to work. And I think that's the point of this whole mugshot project, because I didn't know that this was going to work before I started. So this is somewhere that was about the final where I stopped the program and said, okay, that's about as good as it's going to get. Okay, and then we put it together, and this was the final output. And as you can see here, it wasn't very good. So I didn't use it. And a lot of my results look like this. So I kind of cherry picked the results. And then the one final thing I did here is that, and this was really important, is that I printed out these images in my traditional black and white darkroom. So the artwork, it's not about the image you see on the web, it's about these prints. And this was, that's what we do at SF Camera Work. This is about photography. And what I made was, this is called a digital negative. And for those of you who remember the old overhead projectors, this is like a big transparency. And from there, I make a print, and these are the final prints. So it was important for me to return these images to its original photographic roots, because these guys are all originally made they were done in analog black and white. And it was important that we show these images back to that original medium. Okay, so I just want to finish up here with some of my thoughts about facial recognition and some of the things I found. While I was doing this project, the Hong Kong protests were going on, and I was seeing news footage of like a lot of the protesters being caught on CCTV, and the government's trying to ID these people through their CCTV footage. And I realized that what I was doing could easily become part of this. That if you could create an alternate camera view from one image, it means you could create almost any camera view of a person. And right now they're labeling the person, they're trying to find the name Bob Smith. And here, the next step is to get a complete 3D CG model of a person. So I was getting kind of creeped out, and I realized that that the work I was doing could be abused really badly. Um, the other issue, so there were issues of privacy, there were issues of accuracy. As you can see, this one is not very accurate. This is what the guy is supposed to look like. But I know that in the future, you know, in the next year or two, this image here is going to get sharper and it's going to get better. But the question is it going to get more accurate? You know, we could easily get a sharper picture of the wrong person. Then here's another issue that I had. This one, it just, you know, it got the wrong race. And there was a post today that I read in yesterday in Facebook where they showed a picture, someone's AI app took Obama and it accidentally turned him into a white guy. And this is the exact same problem. And then this is my final image here. Going back to here, the skin tone of this image came out completely wrong. But if you look at the real picture, you can kind of see why. You know, the guy was badly lit, and you know, in the future, you're going to have badly lit photos. You could have badly exposed photos, you know, badly scanned photos. A lot of things can happen to get to this, you know, sort of bad result. So there's a lot of problems ahead. So to finish up here, what I realized with this project was that this technology isn't quite here yet. But when no government is using this yet. But when it does arrive, it's going to have all the problems I just said and all of the problems that we're already encountering with machine learning and with facial recognition. So I guess if anything, this project is a little bit of a heads up. It's a warning of what's coming down the pike. So that's my presentation. Oh, Seth, you got to turn on your mic.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was really great. That was really, really interesting, I think, especially as someone who's mucked about in a dark room and you know, has spent time developing images first in film and then digitally, to see the lack of human origin of those images, I think, is very powerful for a lot of us. One thing that I want to be sure we do as we segue into the conversation with our panelists is come up with a decent working definition for facial recognition. You know, I've been thinking about this since I was invited to moderate the panel, and there's something very personal about facial recognition for all of us. It's how we identify our family, our friends, strangers on the street that we may wind up encountering, you know, days or years later. And we are teaching machines to do it in a way that I feel like we're not really preparing for the consequences of that recognition. There are certainly some uses of facial recognition that feel acceptable. The use, everyone who has one of the more modern iPhones, I think, is very excited to be able to flick the phone towards their face and have the phone unlock. Unless you're like my fiance who has a twin sister, and then, you know, they're able to prank each other when they're in the same city. But then there's a much darker side to facial recognition, where it's used for surveillance, and we see the consequences of that, you know, as people are misidentified for crimes, but also, you know, sometimes accurately identified for crimes that they thought that they were not identifiable for in the first place. So facial recognition is something that technologically is out there. We are working on as a society, but we don't necessarily know where it's going. And I think a good place to start, especially here, you know, in the US, is how different states and different cities are restricting facial recognition use in surveillance. And I think that's Liz and Claire's bailiwick. So if you guys would like to jump in and talk about that, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, so a little bit more about my background. So I have been in the New York tech industry for the last 9 or so years. My last job was a computer vision company where we were really working to build facial recognition. And so I got this front row seat for how things are done and how they're made. And I quit that job because, you know, there was just so much, and this is just industry standards that I'm talking about here, invasion of privacy, any internet connected camera that you see on the street or in your church or stadium, you know, there's the possibility that there's some partnership that's training, using that data or selling it for training data. So when I was joined STOP, we work on New York City in particular, really excited to see that communities started pushing back on this as of last year. And it's not really surprising to me that the places where we see the greatest resistance to facial recognition, such as San Francisco, Oakland, and Somerville, and most recently Boston, are the same cities where there's just a heavy technical presence. So one of the first places it was proposed was in Washington State, which is of course the home of Amazon and Microsoft. San Francisco, of course, has Silicon Valley, and Somerville and Boston, home of Harvard and MIT. So that's why I think, you know, it's really interesting to see that the people who are either at the corporations or who have personally used AI are pushing back on this technology being legal, because, you know, it's pretty easy to see when you're building it how brittle it is, or how poorly it will work under certain conditions, especially with racial disparity and other concerns for marginalized populations, as Claire said. But also we see who's trying to buy it and where the real money is, and, you know, inevitably that ends up being government. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how local politics handles this. It seems like it's spreading.
I'm happy to jump in. I wanted Liz to go first because the last thing you want to do is have a lawyer answer a question about how do we define something first and foremost. That's just a terrible idea. But so my focus is very much on the law enforcement space, where I describe face recognition is used as an identification tool. Very, very simply, we're taking a photo of an unknown individual, comparing it against a database of known faces, and seeing if there's a match. What's interesting in the law enforcement space is that these systems produce a candidate list, a list of possible matches, where a human is responsible for looking through those and determining whether or not there is in fact a match to then further investigate for a crime, typically, although witnesses and victims can certainly be searched in most jurisdictions. What's interesting to me about this particular function is we like to think we're good at identifying people by their faces. Face recognition is something we all sort of feel like we have a connection to because that's how we recognize people. Some of us better than others. I'm particularly bad at it. However, studies show that we're actually really bad at identifying people or distinguishing between people we don't know. So the ground truth of this assumption that humans can perform this accuracy check and work with an algorithm to decide who is worthy of further investigation and arrest for a crime is actually a fundamentally flawed one. Face recognition more broadly, I would say has other elements. There's face classification, basically very simply determining somebody's characteristics or trying to describe or classify a face into various buckets, such as gender, race, age, but also emotion detecting. Is this person angry? Is this person paying attention, etc.? That's loosely classified as face recognition. And then face verification as well. Is this person who they say they are? So this is what happens in some places of employment, for example. I would scan an ID card, it would take my photograph and compare those two and make sure that I am the correct person. One thing I wanted to say in response to Adam's presentation, which was fascinating to me, but also it's very troubling how close we are to that reality, actually, that life is very much imitating art these days in the face recognition space. And what I mean by that is a common feature of face recognition algorithms is 3D modeling. Most photos that law enforcement are intaking and looking to identify are not people looking straight at a camera like they are in a mugshot. They are turned away. The cameras are often above our heads. So it's a tilted face. And yet those photos need to be compared to a face looking directly at the camera. So not to worry, you have an algorithm that actually 3D models the face, rotates it, and makes it so that it's looking straight at the camera. Can that happen? Well, from an evidentiary perspective, and we're talking about evidence in an investigation, no, an algorithm is actually making up data that you're then inputting into a biometric identification tool that has real world consequences like arresting somebody. So to me, it was just so eerie to watch it in action and to see an algorithm attempt to do something that's very, very challenging and basically come up with data that it approximates looks like what the face from a different angle would look like, but in no way can actually stand for actual evidence of someone's identification.
Thanks, Claire. That's really interesting. It puts me in mind of the problem with deep fakes. If people aren't familiar with those, they're computer-generated videos that look authentic, but aren't. Most often used to prank politicians, but there's a scary reality that we're hurtling towards, I feel, where it seems like people are saying things or doing things because it's happening on video, where they have not actually said or done those things. And that's, especially at a time when so much evidence is being, is dependent on a visual record of that action. That puts us, I think, in some pretty scary territory. And I'm wondering from all of the panelists, but I'd like to hear first from Anastasia, if you have an opinion on this. How can we tell when an image has been computer generated or has been used to influence a machine learning algorithm in a way that is manipulative or inauthentically manipulative? I suppose everything is manipulative to some degree or another, but McLuhan isn't here, so if you could chime in on that, that'd be great.
Sure. So it's actually, if it's done very well, extraordinarily difficult to tell. There's ways that you can kind of dig into how it's constructed and try and sort of pull the pieces apart a little bit, but really, like, it's not that easy. At least for the average person. I mean, there's a lot of academic work around this. And so I think what we're seeing now is the rise of companies that are providing things like third-party authentication for images. So there's like this notion that, at some point in the near future, we are probably not going to be able to tell whether something is real or fake because the technology is going to operate so seamlessly. And I think so the Obama deepfakes are a really excellent example of like, the capabilities of the technology now. It's being scaled so that these types of tools will be available to the average person. And for the most part, it's like, people probably want to make entertaining content and memes and like, but there are always bad actors and people with sort of kind of like, they're trying to cause harm. And so I think that's a really big challenge that the next decade is going to be very telling in this space for sure. And I would say, like, for me, a couple of things really stand out. So one is like adopting authentication processes and just standardizing them across distribution platforms, social media being a big one. Another is, I think, educating people to bring a critical eye to what they're consuming, so that if something seems kind of off, to be questioning it. So those would be the two pieces. And I think like facial recognition or facial, like the use of face data, of face biometric data is a big, you know, as Claire mentioned, like you can, the algorithm to 3D reconstruct a face from a single image came out in 2017, I think. So, and people have been iterating on it, making it faster and more efficient. So one of the initial draws for that was like, create a 3D model of your face from a selfie. How many selfies are there out like in the world that people could easily access on your publicly available profiles, and then use input into something like this to generate deepfake content. So I'm always like the harbinger of terrible ideas on this front. It is a ever-growing and concerning space.
Yeah. One of the viewers, Liger, makes a really great comment that defenders and investigators are always behind technology, which is a really good point and kind of very terrifying in the space where the technology has dramatically improved so very rapidly. I don't want to get too off into politics and geopolitical concerns, but is this something that countries should be coming together on and discussing? Should there be international standards? And maybe the hardest question of all, how do you teach Silicon Valley ethics when it comes to facial recognition? And any of you that want to chime in, please do.
Yeah, so it is interesting because as with most new technologies, there's always this drive to try to standardize it to make room for international collaboration, and something that we're seeing happening pretty regularly, especially through efforts at the UN, is that you know, the standards are actually being dictated by China, and they're doing this largely in underdeveloped countries. There's this big play right now to be able to basically collect data from the African continent and to sort of try to own that technology industry. So, you know, I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly is an indicator of where they're eager to spend their money and effort and political clout.
Related point on the international space is that there's a tension, especially with face recognition, around the perceived benefits and the risks. So the UN Development Program is very, very active in the population registration space. There are an estimated between 1 and 1.5 billion people who can't prove their identity and therefore can't prove citizenship, can't vote, aren't eligible for benefits. And that's a huge development concern and a human rights concern. Biometric registration has been seen as the solution to that. Face recognition started playing a role in that around 4 years ago, with governments being very interested in the ability to do remote identification. So the UN has been working on that, not completely cognizant of the fact that they are simultaneously creating surveillance databases of their entire population, that with a regime change or with just some bad actors can very, very quickly turn from a tool of development to a tool of mass surveillance, or, you know, both simultaneously. So as Liz mentioned, the Chinese companies are very, very active in the international space, pushing a very pro data collection and pro product agenda for sure.
Are there ways that we've seen successful influence of China and China's interests in technology in the past that might show us a potential way forward in how we could influence them with facial recognition and AI-based surveillance?
not that comes to mind.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that may be a hard one, and one that we need a even broader panel for. One
I mean,
thing that,
sorry, just to
yeah, please.
largely the what comes up in the media regarding China's use of facial recognition is that it's pretty negative. I mean, it's sort of primarily for mass surveillance from the security side, and then a lot of, I'd say, maybe questionable research coming out of many institutions. So, for example, South China University released a facial beauty predictor. So a scale of rating people 1 to 5, and if you look at the training sets they used, they were primarily Asian, very light, very super subjective, and just really, really questionable like data. And there've been numerous cases of this, this type of research, I think, coming out of Chinese institutions, actually other places as well. I mean, even Stanford, for example, with their questionable facial recognition data. So I think that like one of the, just to speak to international cooperation around this technology, one of the factors to contend with are just these very varying sort of cultural differences and values in terms of like what governments want, what technology is being funded, what the outcomes are for a given country. And I would say like countries that have more of a explicit and pervasive security presence tend to be looking towards like more of these extreme security applications. So like, how can we pick up a person out of a crowd of 10,000 people accurately? And seeing some success in doing that, which is, I think, just something to note on that front.
So I always find it very interesting when these conversations happen that there's this very visceral reaction to the Chinese social credit score and to their use of facial recognition. And we sort of point at that and say like, oh, that's worst case scenario. It's this authoritarian regime, you know, they don't have democratic values, et cetera. But then, you know, what people often don't see is that a lot of the same things are happening right here in the United States, and we're not finding out about them for years until, you know, entities like Georgetown and Clare can FOIA them and then spend, you know, a year of their lives digging through these reports and trying to bring this information to the academic community. But, you know, if you lived in Michigan in the last 5 years, even longer than that, and you had a driver's license, then your face ended up in a facial recognition database, whether you knew it or not. In some cases, your DMV driver's license in the state of California, these photos are sold to create training sets to build facial recognition to private entities and sometimes internationally as well. If you had an account on Flickr as well, you know, these were under a Creative Commons license that were then repurposed by Microsoft, who then shared it with, you know, Chinese military academies. So, you know, this pervasive surveillance, this, you know, live camera facial recognition is a product that's very active. It's being sold very aggressively through American private industry. Even home cameras, like your Ring doorbell, doesn't yet have facial recognition, but we know through a leaked product roadmap that they always intended to put it there. Even if it's not Amazon, Arlo cameras, for instance, have facial recognition in them as well. So, you know, I think that it would be remiss to think that this isn't something that we as Americans in democratic society also have to worry about.
Even in schools, like a lot of Florida schools, after some of the school shootings of recent years, have adopted like facial recognition, mandatory facial recognition for students using Amazon recognition. So it's really pretty pervasive.
Yeah, and not even just in schools, but very passively in shopping centers and malls and you know, other places where we go, we think we are, you know, although they're public spaces, they are being run by private entities and they're controlled. And we know that there are surveillance cameras there that have been used to mistakenly identify you alleged criminals. And we've also seen instances where surveillance cameras have been accidentally pointed in, the wrong place at the right time and caught somebody hitting somebody else with a car, for example. The way that societally we've constructed how we want to use this technology, I think is very complicated and almost like a panopticon of itself. One thing I'd like to hear more of, and for people who don't know, today San Francisco became the latest city to limit the release of pre-conviction mugshots of people who've been arrested. And San Francisco isn't the first, but it's one of the earlier ones to do this. Sends a signal because the city is worried about reinforcing stereotypes. That to me indicates that there's a more complicated conversation happening. Adam, can you chime in and talk about sort of what you saw in this database from NIST and how experiencing it changed your views on on criminal mugshots that were published?
Yeah, I mean, it took me a year to figure out my feelings of why I was so disturbed of working with the mugshots, and I realized, and it was only the other day that I felt like I was experimenting on prisoners. And it was like I was two steps from Joseph Mengele, and that was not the space I wanted to be. I had also played with another database. It's called Celeb A, and that was another popular one. And the problems I had with that one was it's clearly someone had gone through and scraped the internet of celebrity photos. And so that thing had a very skewed view of beauty, because there were mostly Caucasians, and they were like People magazine pictures. And this database was being used widely, and it's still used widely by the researchers to train, but they're neural nets, and not everyone, and so that database was reinforcing an idea of beauty that was restricted to what People magazine sees as beautiful. And that was, it's a really, there's an inherent racism right there. I think the thing why was I so sensitive to this? And I'm not sure why, maybe because I'm maybe a little bit older or a certain generation, but I worry about the younger generation of computer scientists coming up, because right now there's no policing of this. And these tools are actually a little too easy to use, and that a 22-year-old college graduate with a computer science or engineering degree can take these tools and do some amazing things, and also create some amazing abuse. And that's just the world we live in. The 22-year-old is going to have much more ability than I do have. And but I don't think we're teaching them. We're not giving them any ethical lessons about, actually computer science has never had an ethics course. And I think that's my issue at this point, is that law school, I assume, has some ethics courses, and med schools have ethics courses. I think we need one now for computer science.
Sure. There's a question from Eleanor, which I think really sort of hits the nail on the head as to where we're going with this conversation, which is, how do you teach the general public visual literacy regarding facial recognition? I don't know, Anastasia, would you like to chime in?
Sure. So there are many ways. I think the approach that I have personally taken is through using art. Art is really a really amazing tool, that can be a really amazing tool for education, because you can put people into situations where they can experience things for themselves. You can create these scenarios. And so one of the things that I've attempted to do with, maybe with some degree of success, with some of the pieces that I've worked on with facial recognition, is to start teasing out like some of the complexities in the use, and to also try and to educate people a little bit, and to provide some visibility, to give them some fluency with the technologies. So an example of this is the face-to-face series. And in face-to-face, I built a few different versions of these iPhone applications. Because, you know, it's a very common, most people have a phone, many people have an iPhone. We carry these like, you know, very powerful computers around with us all day and don't really think about the capabilities of them. And iPhones have had facial recognition technology for a couple of years now. You know, there's an IR camera. It's tracking 30,000 points in your face in real time, which is pretty phenomenal, right? It's what we use to, what Apple is using to drive things like Memoji, the really fully animated kind of emoji of your face, you know, face filters, things that we all know and love. And so part of this work was to just kind of, to present these capabilities that people are very familiar with. So users would come and sit down in front of a phone, just like a phone set up on a tripod, which would be projected out to a very, very large, like maybe like 30 or 40 foot image, because you can do that with your phone. It's like a computer. And then kind of move around and have a visualization, like a face filter type visualization of these points sort of moving in real time. But the other thing that I was doing simultaneously, while this was like a very delightful experience, is running their face through a database that I've made. So I was able to kind of collect, you know, data on users coming to given events and create data sets from them, scrape the internet for publicly available information, so things that would come up on social media, etc., and build out a database. And I was really interested in using, so it's interesting, Adam went the much more traditional machine learning route in the work that he has been doing. I took a slightly different approach for this series, and that was using commercially available tools. So things like Amazon Recognition, Microsoft's Face API, things that are available to almost anyone for very, very, I think it costs maybe like 0.001 cent or something per image to run it like through this database. I set up a database on AWS, and they have really powerful servers, so I was able to run all of this in real time from a phone. And so just to give people some indication of like what is actually capable out there. And the result of this was that maybe 1 out of 10 people would sit down and have a positive match, and all this information would come up about them, and everyone would turn around and be like, oh, wow, you went to school there. Occasionally, and what was interesting here too was that I think for people of color, particularly women of color, including myself, and many of my Asian friends were repeatedly misidentified as other people. Like, so I was misidentified as other people of color. My Asian friends were misidentified as other Asian friends. And it kept happening again and again pretty consistently. We also noticed things like, you know, changing light conditions, shadowing, like if, as the lighting conditions changed, there was more shadowing on my face. The analysis coming back would be different. So I would start to be misgendered because there was, you know, a little shadow line going on. And so this is, I think what's, you know, the real takeaways here, and I think what a lot of people were able to take out of experiencing this was, 1, it was very inconsistent. 2, they were just frankly horrified that this was a commercially available product that many companies across the US and the police force are using. And interestingly, Amazon very recently decided to halt police use of their recognition technology. I think it was last week, maybe, in part because of the Black Lives Matter protest movement and the call to sort of restructure and kind of defund and to take a very analytical look at how policing works in the country. And so I'd say, like, you know, there's definitely, from, I think it would be naive to think that companies are not acutely aware of the impacts of these technologies and what's happening. And I do genuinely believe that art is a really powerful tool for advocacy, and there's some really amazing artists out there that are doing work in this space.
Hmm. Can you and Adam talk a little bit more about the challenges working in a visual medium but focusing on facial recognition? You know, we know that one of the big problems that companies that employ machine learning algorithms is that these not only are as we saw with Adam's work, that the effectiveness of the algorithm depends extensively, although a little bit less so these days, on the data set that's being, you know, dumped into it. But we're also seeing situations where the quality of the algorithm itself is highly debatable, because the companies are not letting independent auditors take a look at what the algorithm is doing versus what it says it should be doing. And I mean, this seems like a giant morass and very difficult Gordian knot to untie.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I'm a little skeptical of machine learning in general. It is on some level, on most level, there's really no intelligence in it, but it is capable of surprising you once in a while. So in some ways, it's this extremely seductive technology. It's easy, and it's very easy to literally throw things in like a blender, which is what I did. You can be very lazy with this thing. And in order to actually see what's doing, you actually have to drill down and look at and dissect what the nodes are doing. And that's work. And, you know, whereas I can get a lazy result with, you know, about 1% of the effort. And then I can go post it on the internet and say, look how wonderful this thing is that I'm doing. So, well, I actually have a guy who mentors me, and he kind of, his name is Richard Chung, and he says machine learning is, it's like going to a fortune teller. And the fortune teller looks at you, sizes you up, and gives you the answer that they think that the fortune teller thinks you want. You know, it sees that, oh, I'm an Asian man who's of a certain age. This is what he wants to hear. And that's sort of the seductive nature of this technology. So, you know, and it's surprising, but also kind of flawed. I don't know if did that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's any one particular answer. I think that it's, you know, people like you and Anastasia who are attempting to push where these things are going in the first place winds up being incredibly important when so few other people relatively outside of the companies themselves are working on things like this. And Anastasia looks like she's about to jump in, so I'm going to let her speak.
I think that was a really, I second Adam's position here. And also there are researchers that are going out doing kind of independent peer reviews of these technologies, and the results are terrible, of course. Like, so a good example would be Joy Bolognini's lab at MIT and her Gender Shades project, where she looked at, she evaluated, like, you know, I think it's 4 or 5 of the commonly available commercial facial analysis and recognition tools, found that through an intersectional lens, so looking as a woman of color, and found that they significantly underperformed, you know, where they're claiming something like, you know, somewhere between a 95 to 99% accuracy rate matching a face to a face. What she found was that that rate went down to something like sometimes 35%. And that is a pretty significant discrepancy, especially when you're using that tool to potentially arrest someone. So, you know, I think that there are people across the spectrum who are being really critical and there's really, I think, amazing research out there. It's just not necessarily being listened to.
Yeah.
Sure, Sure. I mean, one of the people that I speak with fairly often on these things is a cybersecurity researcher named Gary McGraw, and he's recently, I think in the past year and a half or so, created a machine learning institute that looks at how hackable these algorithms are, which is incredibly important because there's much more to hacking an algorithm than hacking other kinds of code where you go in and change bits here or there. Because in hacking an algorithm, he says you can alter its output by knowing how it makes mistakes. And if you know that it's going to, as Google's algorithm used to do, identify a Black person as a gorilla, then you can really manipulate what the end results will be and come up with some pretty harmful outcomes. So, the idea that these things are static, I think, is something that is challenging to communicate to the wider public.
Yep, there's a famous example where researchers were able to demonstrate that they took a self-driving algorithm, and then just by putting several stickers on, I believe it was either the road or the stop sign. I'm confusing two papers, but they just completely mess up the car's ability to stay on the road.
That it would identify stop signs as speed limits. And the speed limit was much higher than the actual legal speed limit for that road. Right. It's not a problem you want to have in a car, but
no, certainly not. So, but that's it gets at the point that computer vision algorithms, and mostly what we're talking about here is computer vision, not other kinds of AI, and there are other kinds of AI that are less terrifying. But specifically with computer vision, they are entirely made up of just two ingredients. It's the photos and the labels, and the algorithms themselves, like the math is all constructed. It's been done, it's all been released, and that's pretty simple. But the problem is when you get down to why the algorithm is making these decisions, you find almost 9 times out of 10 that the machine has learned to cheat somehow. Nobody's teaching it to cheat. Nobody is saying, here's this shortcut. But one famous example, there is a medical diagnostic algorithm that is supposedly way better, and the whole medical community freaked out, way better at identifying cancerous cells, precancerous cells, before anybody could realize it. And when they used one of these modern techniques, which we call explainability, to reverse engineer what parts of the photo it was keying off of, as it turns out, the machine had figured out it was able to see the pencil marks that the human doctors were putting on the image to say that here's where the tumor ended up being. And this over and over again, and it's the whole field of research called adversarial attacks. And so that's what we mean when we say these models are brittle. When you try to generalize beyond what they're intended to do, they absolutely fail. And that's exactly what facial recognition is doing.
There's a request from Dane in the audience for Anastasia and the rest of the panel to discuss the lack of Black people and POCs in the tech space, and how that influences these biases in facial recognition software towards more successful rendering of white faces. And this, as Dane points out, isn't something that's particularly recent. It goes all the way back to Kodak film and much further back.
Yeah, I have personally had to experience this, unfortunately. I actually got into working with facial recognition and analysis technology because in a slightly different thing, I was using a hand tracking library that had just come out, and I found that it would recognize this side of my hand but not the other one. Or like it sometimes got like my fingertips but not. And I was like, why is this happening? Is there something wrong with what I'm doing? And then started like digging into how these technologies are actually made. And so the training sets that are used, so they're like aggregated very, very, very large sets of images that you use to train an algorithm to say, like, this is a hand, this is a face, these are the features of a face. And so the problem to this day, I know that a lot of companies, at least maybe paying some lip service, but trying to diversify their training sets. A couple of years ago, it was a more significant issue, is that most of the images being used, even the publicly available data sets, are like heavily skewed towards being white and male. And so the accurate, like the algorithms that are using these training sets tend to more accurately recognize white males, not women of color or hands of color. So that is a really fundamental problem. And it's something that is like, you know, when you're thinking about how these technologies are being applied, it definitely scales in a very bad way.
Building on that, the question also mentioned Kodak. So there's this history of Shirley cards of Kodak basically using a photo of a white woman to calibrate the chemical composition of the for photo development. It was only in the 1990s that Kodak adjusted and had a Shirley card that had a black woman on it. So face recognition inevitably is a perfect storm of, especially in the law enforcement space, it's this perfect storm of disproportionality. Hardware, the camera itself, being designed from the beginning of cameras to take high quality photos of white faces and not dark faces. Mm-hmm. The training data sets being disproportionately created of light faces as opposed to dark faces. Communities of color being disproportionately targeted by surveillance. There's this fascinating acknowledgement by San Diego saying, we use face recognition and license plate reading up to 2.5 times more on communities of color than their proportion of our population. Side note, also, we use it 15% more on women for purely voyeuristic reasons, and 65% of the searches of teenagers is for no reason whatsoever. So this disproportionate focus of the technology on communities of color, and then also the disproportionate enrollment in mugshot data sets. A lot of these databases are not people convicted of crimes, they're people who are arrested. And we vastly, vastly disproportionately arrest young Black men in this country, even if those individuals are never charged or have the charges dropped. So it's this sort of crazy, this perfect storm with face recognition of just all the features are set up to disproportionately misidentify communities of color.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up crime, because we've had I think what's a really important question waiting in the wings, and I want to be sure we get to it as we come down to our last 15 minutes or so. Some of you may know that I think 2-ish, maybe 3 years ago, Facebook was using facial recognition to identify victims of child sexual abuse in photos that the abusers were sharing on Facebook in private groups and in chat messages. And what Facebook was doing was not outing these people, but using the facial recognition to identify when there was child sexual abuse occurring, and then using that to report that to legal authorities in the country where it was happening. Which is, I think, a very interesting and challenging place for facial recognition as a technology to be, because you're suddenly not only calling into consideration the technical side of it, but also the Facebook moderator or whomever the company has employed to visually confirm that that image is what the algorithm says it is. And there's a question from Liger about how this also comes into play for child sexual abuse offenders. And I'm curious to hear from the panel on a situation like this, where it's a crime that we all find extremely abhorrent.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. You know, it's interesting that it continually comes up. I think this is a crime that we can all viscerally identify with and say nobody wants that to happen. You know, I think what's more interesting is that when you think about systems of surveillance, and especially camera surveillance in the real world, not so much on private platforms, there have been study after study that show that that camera surveillance does not reduce the incidence of violent crime. And so this trade-off of this constant surveillance versus, you know, the illusion of safety is one that we're forced to make time and time again. In the platform moderation space, the trade-off there is not so much facial recognition and child pornography, but those of you in the InfoSec community might appreciate that the Earn It Act is in Congress right now, where they're asking us to make the trade-off between end-to-end encryption for the sake of saving children. And it's the same argument, you know, over and over again. I think a lot of us would be a lot more open to the idea of retaining some degree of legal facial recognition if there were any demonstrable, you know, society level proof that says we can reduce child exploitation or you know, slavery, like human slavery, using these techniques, and there would still retain some degree of privacy. But at the end of the day, you know, what we instead are seeing is that 99% of the market, and we're talking billions of dollars, are being funneled into state, local, federal databases and U.S. military databases of, you know, upwards of 600 million people who are now registered with the U.S. government and being tracked in this way. So, you know, to me, having a free and open democracy, you need to have end-to-end encryption as just an aside, but also the ability to walk around without the fear of being identified or misidentified.
Just building on that, I agree with Liz. I think it is something that's used a lot to promote the idea of face recognition, and I am incredibly sympathetic to that idea. I used to work in human rights. Human trafficking was a focus of mine. It's this tied as the second largest illicit industry in the world, second only to weapons. Is the sale of humans. And so there's part of me that says, yes, any tool necessary to combat that, by all means. I think the challenge is exactly what Liz said. And going back to something you said earlier, Seth, this idea of, it's interesting to see like societally how we've chosen to use this technology. And I would actually contend that we as a society haven't actually done any of the choosing. It's companies that have. And they use trafficking or counterterrorism as this logic for selling a tool, for making money. They fundamentally don't really care how it's used at the end of the day, as long as they get to keep selling their technology. So yeah, I think with face recognition, there are always arguments. It's an identification tool. There are always going to be positive uses. For every positive use, in the absence of regulation, there are a lot of negative uses. So I would just hope that at some point, and I think we're seeing a move towards us as a society being able to actually have a voice in that conversation and to democratically choose what we want, whether we want face recognition to be used. And honestly, when communities get to decide, they ban it. That's kind of what we're seeing. Communities in San Francisco, in Boston, in Oakland, in Somerville have had the opportunity to have this conversation with their legislators, and the technology's been banned. I think some jurisdictions are probably going to come out differently on that decision, but thus far, the way the technology has been used, the default has been companies deciding that it's a good idea for them to sell to law enforcement and basically not tell anyone.
And just one last thing, and in the middle of all of this Black Lives Matter protests and this incredible movement that we're seeing people push back on the abuse of authority, you know, I don't even know, Claire, how many facial recognition, how many states, how many cities are using facial recognition? You know, it's more than 50 cities, you know, hundreds of cities. But we're seeing it be used on protesters. We're seeing the president call for the monitoring of protesters. This isn't new. We shouldn't just assume that because they have this new tool, they haven't used it yet. It's like, oh, this is, maybe they haven't, it hasn't occurred to them. Tracking of protesters has been happening for 100 years or longer. And so tools like Clearview AI, which is just, basically a scrape of the internet that can identify anybody, without a previously known mugshot match or anything like that. They're out here advertising that they can do this kind of thing. This is exactly what democracy was built to resist, is the tracking of activists and protesters, so that we can dissent against our government without the risk of being incarcerated for it. So I think in the middle of all of this, we have to remember that the ability to disagree with your government becomes a lot less possible when you have a network of internet connected cameras everywhere, or that every photo you're uploading online is going to be subject to this kind of face matching and accessed by law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you both talk a little bit about specifically the locations in the U.S., but also around the world, if they're relevant, that have taken steps to restrict the use of facial recognition in surveillance? I think it would be helpful for our audience to sort of get a better sense of what's been allowed, where are things being tightened, and where are privacy rights being worked on.
I'm happy to give a quick overview of that. So basically the default in the US is that there are no rules governing how and when face recognition can be used by law enforcement. There are 3 states that restrict to, actually just 2 states that restrict to some capacity the use of face recognition as a biometric by private entities and commercial entities. That's Illinois most prominently, and also Texas. Washington has a biometrics law on the books, but they seem to have excluded face recognition in their definition, which makes it a very weak law from this perspective. So in the last year or so, we've seen local jurisdictions completely ban the technology, face recognition. That's been in, I think, 8 or 9 jurisdictions, exclusively in California and Massachusetts so far. So unfortunately, coastal, pretty affluent communities and majority, minority, and low-income cities that are way more surveilled than Boston, like Baltimore and Detroit and Chicago, have not had the opportunity to have this conversation yet. Just last week, there was a huge shift. So an individual, the ACLU has found a case of a man in Detroit who was misidentified using face recognition. He spent 20 hours in prison. The whole case from start to finish is a mess. It was not him. The algorithms got it wrong.
I remember that, and it feels very close in a lot of ways to issues that we've seen over the past 40 years, 30 to 40 years, with the misidentification of suspects thanks to DNA. And I think in the nightmare fuel that I come up with at 3 a.m, there's going to wind up being a single database that'll connect how you look and facial recognition to your DNA, and that doesn't really bode well for anyone, I think.
It already exists. There's an international mandate after the terrorist attacks in 9/11. The United Nations required all member states to start collecting biometric databases, and that could be genes, it could be photos, it could be fingerprints, but their guidelines are expanding every year.
Right. So we're coming up on our last few minutes, and I think what would be good for us to sort of end on is everyone chiming in on how can we, as private individuals, start to get a handle on the very complicated issues that facial recognition and machine learning and art bring up?
I have a couple of thoughts. So definitely there's some really amazing organizations doing advocacy work around this. The ACLU is really fantastic. The EFF has like a whole, Electronic Frontier Foundation has a whole kind of surveillance, biometrics, facial tracking analysis sort of, where they're like, you know, really critically trying to engage with these issues. Meredith Whittaker's AI Now, she's writing like white papers and just really kind of practical, critical discourse on the use of AI and these types of technologies. So just from an educational perspective, I think that those are really fantastic resources. I think a couple of artists also come to mind. So Adam Harvey is like one of the I guess globally one of the main figures in the space, working with artists in the space who's working with facial analysis and recognition technology, and he's been doing that for many, many years. He has a lot of, a whole body of work around these issues. And then if you're going to a protest, wear a mask or like some kind of CV Dazzle type thing. There's a group out of the UK called something Dazzle, the Dazzle Club, and they are like, you know, sharing different types of face paint that you can do to confuse at least the current, most of the current algorithms. They'll probably, you know, pick those up relatively soon, but it's kind of a fun way to engage with the issue.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in here. I have a sort of a slightly more depressing view of this, because I found that for what I'm doing is I'm trying to find how much information, I'm trying to extend photography in a way, how much information is in a given photo. And I found recently that everywhere I turn, I'm actually aiding this whole facial recognition, you know, and I'm looking at it in sort of in a way of trying to extend photography. You know, what I was thinking about, like the other night, was that what I'm looking for is sort of like, I'm treating every photograph now as if it's a half-completed jigsaw puzzle, or a sequence of photos as a half-completed jigsaw puzzle. And I'm using machine learning as this tool to try to visualize the other half of the jigsaw puzzle. And a really good example of this was is the mugshots. So you have a picture of a person's face. It's the front view. And in the regular world, this means that that's the whole picture. But in the context of the mugshots, there's a whole nother image there. And it's an implied image. This is the profile view. So in the research that I'm doing, I realize that I'm starting on this search for implied images. And this is sort of an artistic concept. And it's pretty cool. And right now the tool is machine learning that I'm using to look for these implied images. But unfortunately, every step that I take starts contributing toward these facial recognition systems, because it is sort of like the same science. So yeah, I don't have I wish I had a better answer.
Great. Claire or Liz, either of you want to chime in on that final question?
Maybe a slightly more optimistic take, although a little more general, is I think what I find, I work a lot with public defenders who have face recognition show up in their cases, and it can often be very intimidating. This is, you know, the companies are going to throw machine learning, neural network, whatever language at you. You don't have to be a technologist. You don't have to have a computer science background to understand what's going on and to participate in the discussions. The communities, when they have the opportunity to engage, do make meaningful change in the community. So if you're an active member of your community, like, make your voice heard, make your legislators work for you. I feel like that's very sort of, that sounds like a very pandering, like overly optimistic answer, but the reality is that's how we're going to get it changed. It should not be up to us as individuals to protect our First Amendment protected rights. vis-a-vis surveillance cameras. It's up to the governments not to intrude on our First Amendment protected rights. So that's where the decision has to happen. Yes, paint your face, wear a mask. I love that idea, but also engage in the democratic process, because that's where we're going to see real change happen.
Liz?
Thanks. I'll just agree with Claire. You know, I think one of the most interesting things for me is that I've only been an activist for the last year and a half. Prior to this, I was happy to just do my work in my software startups job and live my life and watch TV and play video games. But as soon as I got involved, the first thing that I did was talk to my city council member. And at the end of that day, he signed on to a bill that we were sponsoring at STOP. And it was the first privacy bill that I've ever been a part of. So seeing that happen, I can tell you that especially at the local level, your voice matters. You have a say. But what we're up against is the big tech companies and their millions of dollars of lobbying money. There's a bill that was just defeated in California, for instance, that was written by Microsoft. This is the same bill that passed in Washington State against the wishes of the ACLU. Lord knows how big industry was able to convince a supermajority of Democrats with wide public support to pass their own version of the bill. So we won't speculate on that, but we need every voice that we can get, and especially in city council, especially at the state level. Your opinion really matters, whether you agree with me or don't. At least write an email, make a phone call, ask for a meeting. If you do, they pretty much have to meet with you, and there's plenty of organizations that are happy to be there to give you support while you're there.
Yeah. I'm really glad you ended on that. I think it's super important that we all remember that as photography has become democratized to anybody who can put in their hands one of these things, it also comes with responsibility. I want to thank all of the panelists, Liz and Claire and Adam and Anastasia, for joining us tonight. It's been a real pleasure talking with you all. Audience members, I'm so glad that at the peak I saw over 75 people listening in and contributing a really active and engaged level of questioning. Not all those questions were easy, but it was, it's really important that we do get them out there and we do start talking about them. Really excited for how this turned out. Thank you all so very, very much. And I'm going to throw it back to Dave from SF Camera Work.
Hey, Seth, thank you so much. I'll just reiterate the thanks to you and to our panelists. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. Our relationship with these technologies is clearly, this is one of the defining issues of our era. It doesn't seem like we should have any more defining issues given all we're dealing with, but this is critical, and it's easy to look past it. So I'm really excited that this conversation ended with a call for us to take back control and engage with democracy and pass the kind of reform and legislation we need to protect ourselves. And as ever, art and photography help us to understand and come to terms with these complex issues and ideas about who we are. So anyway, I want to thank also Pete Brook for his curation of this entire exhibit around which we've had these compelling conversations, and to Christina Graber for helping us to produce this and all of our programs. As we conclude, I'd like to turn your attention to our Instagram stream. Our call and response project brings together artists, scholars, curators, and collectors who identify as Black and African American. We began today with a series of powerful images from Chris Johnson, and we're honored to be working with these image makers. And in addition to Instagram, we'll be working with them to develop some more programming in the coming weeks. So please visit our website for the latest. Visit our website to see all the work related to cell signals. And as always, thank you to our members for your support. And if this was your first time gathering with us, please consider joining us or making a donation. We'd love to see you again. You can visit us at sfcamerawork.org. And with that, thank you. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And I will say good night. Thank you for joining us, everybody.